Okay, everybody. So today's video, we're going to be talking about feudalism and how we go from the Middle Ages and that government system and structure of feudalism and then slowly move towards the Age of Absolutism, where you have a lot of central monarchies. You have France becoming a power. You have England rising up a bit. We're going to talk about Spain, Prussia, all those different European superpowers around the 1500s and 1600s. But first, in order to get there, we have to discuss feudalism a little bit, because that was the system that was in place far before the Age of Absolutism, during that entire Middle Age period that you guys know about, with the knights and the swords and the horses and all that. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the rise of central power, absolutism, and the decline of manorialism, which is essentially feudalism. So the first thing we did in class is we actually looked at a Star Wars clip of Kylo Ren talking to the girl in the movie. I forget her name off the top of my head, but he's basically trying to pull some Jedi mind tricks on her and control her mind. So we watched that video, and you can see the clip there if you'd like. In order to discuss power and control is ultimately what everybody wants in life. I mean, once a tiny little thing gets under our control and we can't really deal with it and we can't really control it, it messes us up. When a friend wants to do something that we don't want to do and we kind of get forced into doing it, it like screws up our entire day. And so power and control is something that everybody wants, from rulers to people like us, from teachers to garbage men. It doesn't matter. Everybody wants control. And so we kind of discussed those things in classes. Why do we want to have control? What might be getting in the way of us getting that control? And then we transition to think about power, which can ultimately be interchangeable with control. What makes someone powerful? What makes a powerful ruler? So it's a good segue into making the connection of the Age of Exploration, which we've already been discussing, where you have many nations that are beginning to colonize different areas, and they seek to expand their control, their power. And that's ultimately what's known as the Age of Absolutism, where these central monarchies were essentially financing different explorers like Christopher Columbus and other people to go out and find new lands, new trade routes, get new goods, new resources, and expand their reach to more widespread regions, even crossing continents and oceans. So if we needed to define the Age of Absolutism, we could ultimately define it as total and complete power. It is essentially absolute, right? It is absolutely full and control of everything that they have. So as a result of this new system, the old one obviously is going to be gone. When the old one was feudalism, out with the old, in with the new. But again, we need to discuss just what was the old system. What was this feudalism? Why does it sound so weird and so foreign to us? Well, we're going to discuss it. Here you have a feudal pyramid. And this is very important for you to remember. If you don't remember anything else, I hope that you pay attention to this, because this kind of sums up what you essentially need to know about feudalism. So you have this pyramid, and you have essentially the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class, but they really weren't too middle classish like we would think of today. And the feudal system is really based on reciprocity. So you give and you get, you give and you get, you give and you get. The only person that's not really giving too much is the king. He's giving out land, but he's ultimately the one at top. He's the end of the buck, if you will. He's the very end of that pyramid. So there's nobody above him. All right. So you have the peasants and the serfs that are down here, and they're essentially going to be working the land for the knights. The knights, in return, are going to offer them protection. Now, you have over top of the knights, you have the nobles and lords, and they're essentially the ones giving land to the knights to own, and those knights are allowing the peasants to live on their land. Now, how are the lords and nobles getting that land? Well, ultimately, the king is divvying up that land to them, and in return, he's getting their loyalty, and he's also getting military aid, because it was the lords and the nobles who essentially contracted out these knights here in this middle-ish area. Okay, so The peasants are going to work the land for the nobles and knights, who in turn offer them protection. You can see that over here. The nobles are going to give some land to professional soldiers, the knights, and that's what I'm talking about. There's a give and there's a get. There's a give and there's a get. And ultimately the king is receiving everything from here, including taxes, including loyalty and aid, because in this time, just as it's called feudal system, there were a lot of feuds going on, but they were more localized. You didn't have a central government. You had little tiny localities, local governments, with different kings set up over different areas, different pieces of land. And when you think feudalism, you should think land, because feudalism and land goes hand in hand. You can't really have feudalism without really land during this time, because land was the currency of the time. Land was what was most important. You couldn't farm without the land. You couldn't live without the land. And so everybody wants the land. And the only ones that don't really get any land to own are the peasants, but they are allowed to live on some of the knights' land, again, in return for actually getting the crops and giving some of those crops away to the appropriate people, the knights, and then the knights would give to the nobles and lords, and the nobles and lords would give to the king. So you give and you get, you give and you get. So it's very important to know this pyramid, familiarize yourself with it, and familiarize yourself with these different class systems here, because the feudal system has much to do with these class systems. Very, very important. Here you see another more cartoonish little pyramid, but it does the same purpose, perhaps even a little bit better than the last one, right? So you're going to have the peasants are offering food and services to the knights are offering protection and military service to the nobles, and the nobles are offering money and knights to the king. In return, the king's going to give land to the nobles, and the nobles are going to give land, or what they called fief. Fief is essentially land. If you hear the word fief, if you hear the word fiefdom, they're talking about land. They're going to give that to the knights, and the knights are essentially giving land and protection to the peasants. But don't be confused. They're not just handing over their land to the peasants. They're more often than not allowing the peasants to work the land for them, live on it, and kind of eat some of their crops that they're building. Okay, kind of like a tax. But it was really based on giving and getting so that everybody could kind of get along in this small localized government. So feudalism, as we've already kind of discussed, is a decentralized power, and that means power is relegated to specific localities. You have smaller regions of government. They are not widespread. You don't have the colonies yet. You don't have large overgrown nations. You don't have that yet. In addition, it's very hard to move up the social status ladder. You can't really go from peasant to knight, or from knight to noble or lord, or from noble and lord to king. Really doesn't happen. It's next to impossible to move up this social ladder, so to speak. Also, as we've already discussed, it's based on reciprocity. People are giving things in order to get other things, such as the peasants work the land in return for protection. And the king is at the top. That's probably the easiest thing to remember. It's the king's at the top of the pyramid. He's the top dog. Now, absolutism, on the other hand, is very different, and it's much more centralized. And when we're talking about central governments, we're talking about an overreaching type of government that's extended through a lot of land, not just localized government. Plus, you have one individual or a very small group of people in charge of everything. And this is where the divine right of rulers comes in. And so you can see that key word there, divine right. And that ultimately means rulers are believing that they represent God's will, and therefore subjects had a religious duty to obey. So if you broke a law, you weren't just breaking the king's law, you were sinning against God, because God put that king into power and made him king. It's God's will that he is king. So to go against that king is to go against God. So they add this religious component to it, which makes people obey even more and more and more, because it's a religious duty. It's part of their Christian practice or their Catholic practice. And with absolutism, you have this centralized government, which ends up evolving into nation states, where you have a bunch of different states that are made up of essentially nations, much like America is today, but back then it was a bit different because it was more fragmented. but yet they were still somewhat unified. And some of the characteristics that come with that, you can see right here. You have very strict boundaries, you have a unified role, and you have permanent armies. Again, for the most part, America has those characteristics of a central government because we have the federal government, right? We have strict boundaries, even though we have debated that historically, like with Mexico and with Canada. We've debated those boundaries. For the most part, we know where Texas is. We know where the 50 states lie, and then when you cross into Canada nowadays. There's a unified role as well. Everybody is aiming to be good citizens, ideally. Obviously, some people differ with that, but for the most part, everybody is unified as Americans. And then we also have a permanent army under a centralized government. Same as back then in the Age of Absolutism when they have that. Armies cannot take a weekend off. A king or a president can't decide, hey, army, you're going to be gone for the summer. Go on vacation. Have fun. Don't get a suntan, right? Don't get sunburned, whatever. It's not going to happen because then you're susceptible to attacks. And when you have more centralized powers, you risk expansion into your territory, which is essentially what many people in the Age of Absolutism are trying to do. Everybody's trying to expand, especially Spain and especially France and some of these other places. And then even America later on in American history, you see America tries to expand, and we end up kicking Native Americans out. We end up kicking the Mexicans out of some of their territories. We take some land from Canada, all of that. And we did that with permanent armies. Now, the citizens then share a language, a culture, national loyalty, and religion. Sometimes. I mean, again, some of these things are a little bit more loose, but again, what's the major language in America? Well, it's English. What's the major culture? Well, people generally differ a little bit state by state, but everybody will know who Justin Bieber is. Everybody will know what the NFL is. Everybody will know who won the Super Bowl. Everybody knows those things. We share some type of common culture. We have a national loyalty. Oh no, battery's dying. We have a similar religion, even though that can differ. For the most part, most people in America would probably say that they are Christian. Whether or not that's actually accurate, who knows? And then we moved in the class to some discussion questions, which obviously in a video we're not going to go over, but you can at least see what they are. What effect do you think feudalism has made on our modern world? How does it possibly compare to our government? There are some similarities in the social classes, but you also have to remember that there's a lot of differences too, because we have a constitution and we have checks and balances, whereas a central monarchy and even feudalism, I should say, didn't really have that. Feudalism was the king was on top and you had these social classes. There really were no checks and balances. It was just all reciprocity. Discussion question number 2 looked at 3 different arguments, and it asks you to decide which one's the strongest. So again, you could read these on your own time to kind of get a feel for what we did in case you missed it. But for the most part, everybody was there, and for the most part, we've discussed this at length. So I'm fairly confident you guys know this. Discussion question 3 was a statement, and you have to either agree, somewhat agree, strongly disagree, or somewhat disagree. It is impossible for the majority of people in America to move up the social ladder. Again, we kind of used our feudalism debate and used our feudalism knowledge to compare it to our modern world, because it's really important to learn from history, not just learn about the past, but see how the past influences the future. And so that's one of the reasons why we did that. In addition, you'll find in this Google slide, which I make available to everybody, some links of some helpful videos, not videos I made, but just videos that I found on YouTube that are very helpful. And then we went on, and here's a current event article. A lot of people are comparing the feudalism as old and making it into this neo-feudalism, oftentimes talking about corporate structures or even the American system of having a president, having a military, having all these different things that go from upper class, middle class, and low class. And those same people are saying that it's impossible to really move up the social ladder. So that's really what we're talking about, and I hope you learned something. All right. See ya.